Anabaptists from some weeks ago, they said we need to be able to live and worship the way that we are seeing the Bible telling us, and not the way the bishops are saying we have to do it. Even if our country goes a different way, we have to follow what we feel God is saying to us. And they came to be known as the separatists, because they separated from the Church of England. Pretty simple there. And this was not some huge organization, not a political machine by any stretch. It was mostly just house churches, very reminiscent of the very start of church. And so, yeah, very diffused, not real organized. These were just little knots of people who felt like they had to break away for their own spiritual health. So we're going to focus in on two groups of these. The ones who were really serious about kind of following their convictions felt a lot of heat. And this again, it's the same story already. We're seeing repeats of the same kind of things. They felt like in order to be free to worship the way they needed to, they had to be away from England, just because it was dangerous there for people who didn't toe the line. And so both of them, they moved to another European country. Who wants to guess? Where do you think people who needed to worship in an honest way would go? Just what pops into your mind? Holland, yeah. They all went to the Netherlands. Now that doesn't mean every single person, but these two congregations both went that way for whatever reason. That's where they ended up. One of the groups was led by a man named John Robinson, and they moved there. Things were going well, but he was looking around at their congregation, at their kids, and he started thinking, these kids are becoming Dutch children, and they're forgetting that they're English. We're losing our heritage here, which is not a terrible thing, but he didn't like that. And so he came up with this crazy idea. He's like, they're doing this stuff called a colony in this new place called Virginia. Maybe we should join in on this whole colony thing. And John Robinson and a small group, not the whole bunch, some of them liked it there. Some of them joined up with some others seeking religious freedom, and they got on board a ship called the Mayflower. You ever heard of that one? And ended up in Plymouth, Massachusetts. We'll pick up their story later. For now, shifting over to the other group. This group was led by a former Anglican priest named John Smith. And
don't show your age.
They don't spell like your name.
And another of their leaders was a man named Thomas Helwys. You ever heard of Smith and Helwys?
A publishing company.
A publishing company, among other things, yeah. So they had gone to Amsterdam. They were there in the capital. They left England when the temperature just kept rising, and it got to where King James was actively persecuting people who didn't attend church faithfully. Just try to wrap your mind around it. The police are looking for me because I didn't go to church. Yeah, I mean, really, that was honest to goodness what was going on. And they just said, I guess we're separatists because we can't do this. And so they left and went to Amsterdam. And we don't know for a fact, but there is a lot of speculation that they connected with some of the Dutch Mennonites. Remember we talked about them? And that, just because the thinking's so similar, and it just seemed like they were influenced by those kinds of practices and convictions. It just seems like. So that's a strong suspicion of historians that there was a connection there. So fast forward a few years, and John Smith had a revelation. This is one of those where you just, to be a fly on the wall. So he realized that his church wasn't a valid biblical church because none of them had been baptized as believers. Every single one in the congregation had been baptized as an infant. And he had this crisis because he thought, this is all wrong. This is not what the Bible says we should do. We're not a real church. So he called a business meeting and he said, I don't think they had invented business meetings yet. But just try to picture him saying, folks, I have bad news. It seems like everything's okay, but we're not a real church. But, again, this was a movement built entirely on conviction, so this was important. And so, in kind of the 1608, 1609, somewhere in that range, they disbanded their church. They gathered and said, okay, we are disbanding what we are now, and we're starting over as a brand new group. And they said, from this point on, this is a church that is based on, membership is based on confession of Christ and believers' baptism. That was important to them. Now, none of them, again, had been baptized as believers. So Smith, he was like, well, okay, I'm the leader here. He went and baptized himself, and then he baptized everybody else. And they still use sprinkling, and that seems a little weird, but for generations that was the only way that baptism was done in their culture. So that was kind of the obvious thing to them. And so as far as we know, ironically in 1611, that's an easy date to remember for some reason. 1611, the very first Baptist church that we know of that was documented and clearly was established there in Amsterdam. And so, so 1608, 1609, it was 1611, sorry, that Thomas Helwys led some of those, a subgroup, back to England, and they set up the very first Baptist church on English soil in London. And so that's pretty revolutionary stuff there. I think that we visited that place as a child, but as a young teenager, you're like another old building, but anyway. Pretty cool. So, these are the Baptists that became us kind of Baptists. There's still a lot of ways to go, but this was for real. These weren't just people who were similar or in the same vein. These are the Baptists that spawned us eventually. And as soon as there were Baptists, there were two kinds of Baptists. Anybody surprised?
No.
Not a bit. So, and this is just, it's kind of mind blowing and kind of like, well, it was bound to happen. So, Smith and Helwys were part of a group that referred to themselves as General Baptists. They believed that that Christ died for everybody, general atonement for everyone. That anyone who exercised their faith in Christ could be saved. You may remember, sorry to pull out stuff from 2 or 3 weeks ago, but Calvin, remember, said people can't choose God, God just picks. And Arminius, remember, he was the guy who was actually hired to combat the people who argued with Calvin, and he was the one who said, no, I've done my research and I think we have to choose God, that free will is involved. And so those two kind of became the opposite ends of the spectrum. And so these
kind
general...
of like Peter and Paul.
Say again.
I said kind of like Peter and Paul.
Okay. So the Arminian tendencies was all kind of opposite of Calvinism. So by 1650, there were at least 47 General Baptist churches in and around London, not even the whole of the UK, just London. So that spread fairly quickly. On the other side were the particular Baptists. See, it only works if you say it with a snooty upper crust accent. We are particular Baptists. We should be particular just because it sounds so cool. They had a belief in particular atonement, which means Christ only died for particular people. Calvin. Limited atonement. They were Calvinists, so that was really the divide, the Calvinists and the Arminians, essentially, although they didn't use those terms for themselves. So both believed in believers' baptism. So, the confession of Christ and believer's baptism. So that's what really marks these groups as what we think of as Baptists. And so, here we have the two groups of Baptists. So the general Baptists seemed to grow very quickly. The particular Baptists, less so, but they were kind of steadily drawing people from the separatist movement, would kind of drift into these congregations. And the first particular Baptist church was formed in the 1630s. It was because, why else, an established church had an argument about baptism, and one group was like, well, we can't get along with you guys, we're going to have to form our own church. And they started the first particular Baptist church. They also sprinkled, just like the others. So we let's get to the brass tacks. If we are real Baptist historians, we have to say these guys were only semi-Baptist, right? Because they didn't dunk anybody. And if they tried to join a real Baptist church, we'd just say, hey, sorry, you have to start over because that doesn't count. Tongue firmly in cheek. So, the general Baptists had kind of crossed the bridge about baptism for believers only. Particular Baptists were on the same page in regard with that. And it was several more years before immersion became customary. In 1640, this is spectacular. Baptist history, and it's just like splits as soon as there's, I can't believe it. So, the particular Baptists had a big argument and had to split again. Here's why. They just agreed, this is what we do. That's not what they said. They had all gotten together, studied the Bible very carefully, and they said, it looks like baptism involves being dipped all the way into the water. So they all agreed on this, and this just was cool. Okay, we're reading this stuff in the Bible, and it's like the resembling Christ's death and resurrection. So they were all agreement. But then some people said, wait a minute, the only person who can baptize somebody else has to be a truly baptized person. And the people on the other side of the aisle said, hey, it's anybody can baptize, it's a matter of faith. Oh no, so you can see how no, so they split into two groups because they couldn't agree on who was allowed to baptize someone. Isn't that just classic Baptistness? So this first group that believed that you had to be a baptized believer to baptize somebody else, they sent an emissary to the Netherlands, to the Mennonites, to seek baptism. And once he was properly baptized by real believers in the Netherlands, he came back and baptized the rest of the church. The other group, let's see, we actually have some minutes from their business meeting. The pastor said, where there is a beginning, some must be first. So they just started baptizing each other and called it even, So anyway, it wasn't until roughly the 1640s, as far as we know, that they started writing down, here's how you do baptism. You plunge the whole body under the water. So there you go. Now, a little bit on worship. We have some records from people, like I'm going to read you some excerpts from a letter that some people wrote to a friend, and they happened to mention some of the stuff about worship. That wasn't really the point of it. They weren't historians, but this is great. So the earliest Baptist services usually had multiple sermons, no music, no singing. You're liking this, aren't you? I can see you just saying, yes, let's get back to our roots. We do have a record from 1609, all the way that far back. And this was Hugh and Anne wrote to some relatives. And I'm having to translate this from Old English. The order of worship and government of our church. First, we begin with a prayer, and after read some 1 or 2 chapters of the Bible, give the sense thereof and confer upon the same. So the Bible study sounds like, I mean, essentially. That done, we lay aside our books, and after a solemn prayer made by the speaker, he propoundeth some text out of the scripture, that's preaching, exposition, and prophesieth out of the same for the space of 1 hour or so. Y'all never give me a hard time, but you've thought, gosh, this is long. I know. This morning exercise begins at 8 of the clock.
We're glad you put the clock back.
And continues unto 12 of the clock. And a like exercise is observed in the afternoon from 2 of the clock until 5 or 6. So, they'd have dinner on the grounds and then go right back at it for another 3 hours. But again, the rest of the week, they were working their fingers to the bone. This was their day off, and they spent all day at church. All day. That's why Sunday evening existed for so long, was because once you drove your wagon all the way across town to be with everybody, why were you going to run home? So, very long, almost all Bible exposition, discussion, prayer, and there was a lot of emphasis on group participation. It wasn't like just, hey, Pete's going to do all the talking today. They would get together and, it would become kind of an active back and forth. And then some people had to get crazy. It was in the 1680s or so, a man named Benjamin Keach, a pastor that will always live in infamy. He led his church to sing after the Lord's Supper. Oh boy, people talked. But some people liked it. And in a few years, singing during worship became fairly normal. And he was the one who organized and published the first Baptist hymnal in 1691. Do we have a copy of that? It should be in our...
Should be.
Okay, we should definitely have one. Spiritual melody. So by kind of going into the last part of the 1600s, singing psalms and those questionable man-made songs were both fairly common. Although it was very controversial, and yes, churches did split over this singing controversy. Don't you love it? So now we have churches split because we're talking about which instruments to play or which kind of songs. But yes, once upon a time, the idea of singing in church was just too much for some people. So again, when people started out these churches, the Baptists, we call them that, but they didn't really necessarily refer to themselves as Baptists. Usually people called them that in a nasty way. It was an epithet, not, a kind of negative thing. Most of what we call Baptists didn't really like the name Baptist. They would call themselves the Brethren, very Mennonitish, the Brethren of the Baptized Way, the Baptized Churches. They were often called Anabaptists or other much nastier things. And so when we get into the 1640s, here they are saying, okay, baptism by immersion, this is our thing. And they would draw huge crowds who came to see this like sideshow freaky stuff. And they would talk about, we have records and letters people wrote, these crazy people who were plunged in over their head and ears. And so they started calling them Baptists because they were so weird and different. So for context, during the Roman times, the public bath was a very common thing. It was actually the social center of most town. So they liked being clean and associated it with beauty, but only really people with money ever washed. I mean, for real, other than going in the river. But the bubonic plague changed that. There was one of the superstitions, because they didn't know how germs travel and all that stuff, so they thought that your pores opening up in a bath was definitely letting evil spirits in so that you got sick. And many people believed that being coated in dirt would protect you from the plague. And so between those superstitions and the general breakdown in society that happened during that era, cleanliness really suffered in the part of Europe from which most of our ancestors came. And so by the time these Baptists are coming out with these crazy ideas, most people believed that being immersed in water would make you sick. Like they thought that it would do something weird to you. I mean, again, for context, soap was discovered by our ancestors in the 1800s. They came back from the Crusades, and you're like, you'll never guess what we found. It's this weird, crazy stuff. So, I mean, really, up until then, you just kind of rinsed, right? Maybe if you were rich enough, you had perfume. It wasn't until the 1900s where bathing consistently became a normal part of culture. And in fact, and some of you may remember this, but in 1900, for instance, the Saturday family bath was a normal thing. That's what everybody did. They cut the workday in half so that you had time, and because you had to lug it in bucket by bucket, they just did one tub, and the parents used it, and then all the kids in order. And many historians say this is why we have the saying, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Because we're always the last one, and by then there's no telling what the water will have. So, all that to say, getting dunked in the 1600s was something you just never saw and was weird and scary. So it was a little, I mean, people would literally come out and just be like, gawking, I can't believe I'm saying this. These people are crazy. So, another thing that's funny, from our perspective, is to think that there was a time when there were Baptists who weren't organized. That it was a diffuse kind of system, but as the churches established, and didn't have to, fight for survival, they began to develop some structure. And the very first form of organization, the association.
Yes.
Yes, that was the first. That was and has been enduring. And so they would enter into, a common cause, I guess. And work together, and so we have some evidence as early as the mid-1620s where some of the General Baptists would gather and talk about things that were going on, talk about doctrine, and so it wasn't like missions associations yet, but it was gathering to work together, I guess. And one thing that kind of sped that up, there was a civil war in England during the 1640s, and they made political associations, all these different groups for organizational purposes. And after the war, the Baptists were kind of like, hey, we already kind of have these areas established and these kind of connections, so let's use that. And they kind of ran with that idea, and so they used them for fellowship, discussing concerns specific to their churches. And they began to think about, the propagation of the gospel and how to spread the word and that sort of thing, and also maintain doctrine, proper doctrine. They started over time working on confessions of faith, like what makes us Baptist? What are the things that we believe? And we'll come back to some of those later on. They came together, worked towards religious liberty, always an interest of Baptists. And then we had all these different groups, and they started saying, well, shouldn't we have like a general assembly, a group of all of us? Could we do that? And so, of course, they have London there in England, so that was kind of a natural gathering spot. So they began having these general assemblies. The General Baptists were the first to do this as early as 1653. And they formed what would basically be a national convention in our terms. There were differences over what that group should be. Some Baptists thought that, that should be the National Assembly should have decision-making power and should be able to make things happen, and others were like, let's protect the autonomy of our churches and let it just be a collaborative sort of thing that doesn't have any official power. You can see how different that would be in practice.
Well, they had just gotten rid of the hierarchy.
Right,
They
so
left, I mean, they were-
I'm sure some were just like, oh no, let's not go back down that road. But others were like, this is, you know, that's how they
That's
thought.
where they used to.
So, yes, what they were used to. Good observation. This is from the Particular Baptists in 1677. They were thinking about how to handle problems in churches, and this was one of the things that they wrote out. In cases of difficulties or differences, it is according to the mind of Christ that many churches, holding communion together, do by their messengers meet to consider and give their advice in or about that matter in difference, to be reported to all the churches concerned. Howbeit these messengers assembled are not entrusted with any church power properly so called, or with any jurisdiction over the churches themselves, or to impose their determination on the churches or officers. So interestingly enough, and this was the more Calvinist Particular Baptists just wanted complete autonomy, and it was the General Baptists, the ones who were more free will oriented, who thought, you know, we should as a national group have some control. But anyway, that conversation will come back around in a couple of centuries. So over time, our historians tell us that the General Baptists started becoming more and more liberal, and to the point where they became irrelevant in the society. They lost focus on the fundamentals, if you will, and so the Particular Baptists became the dominant form of Baptistness, dominant form of Baptism in England, and so this group that was very Calvinist, you know, actually maybe swerved even more Calvinist over time. And one of the byproducts of that group being the power group in England is that evangelism and missions pretty much were dropped. Which makes sense from that, you know, there's no reason to go run around and do all that if God has picked already. And so that is an important starting point for our discussion of missions that will come. So once we jump over to America, we'll catch up with kind of the Baptist beginnings there, and then we'll take that, you know, what happened in England and sort of, hey, we're good here. This is fine. We'll just enjoy being God's people. And the complete, and I'm not exaggerating when I say the complete halt of missions. By the time we come back to this part of the story, missions is not a thing in English Christian life. So we'll jump over to America and look at some of the things that happened there, and then we will talk about the modern missions movement. You know, the old one was when we marched into countries and enslaved everybody and told them they were Christian. The modern mission movement is more what we think of as missions, and I think you'll be very interested in how that started out. And I'll give you a hint. It started with some Baptists looking at the state of Baptist life and saying, we really need some reform in this church. How about that? Another Reformation. So, questions, comments, deep thoughts?
I think the first Baptist church, I'm not sure, was in Providence, Rhode Island, in America.
We'll find out if you're right. The odds are good, though, aren't
The first Jewish synagogue was there also,
In Rhode Island.
in Providence. I think. Isn't that where, because we went to it, wasn't it? where it
Baptists
was?
use it on Sunday and the Jews use it on
they?
Sunday.
Appreciate it. Oh, that's great.
The church where I grew up, it started that, we were in the temple, or we were in the synagogue on Sunday. They were in there until we had enough time to go to church.
That's great. Anybody? You gotta admit, it's kind of funny and a little ironic that literally as soon as there were Baptists, we started splitting. I mean, that's just
I will say,
Seriously?
to the good point of the Presbyterians as Calvinists, they do now, are involved in missions.
That's good to hear, yeah.
We have, Johnny has stepbrothers that every summer they're being participating. So they've made steps that way.
At the Anglican church, you know, the practicing Anglican church in Saluda, I asked a member about 2 weeks ago, what do you all do for missions? And they said, we don't.
The one
I said,
over.
well, you need to get involved with us.
Yeah, that's right.
And we'll share something there.
The one that's up near the Mary Ball Washington Museum, they don't do missions either. Beautiful church on the inside, but they don't do anything, excuse me. They worship on Sundays.
All right, well, let me close this with a word of prayer, and we'll wrap up for tonight. Father, we thank you for even more examples of people who faithfully followed what they heard you saying, and they listened to your word in their hearts and in the scriptures, and they followed those convictions. And we're so grateful for their example, and to know more about where Baptists came from, some of the things that we agreed on, some of the things we argued over, and some of the things that our ancestors were willing to stand up for and fight for. Lord, help us to be more appreciative of what an easy road we have compared to so many people in the past, and the freedom that we experience and enjoy because of their work and sacrifice. We thank you as always for the chance to challenge each other, to learn, to stretch our minds, and to grow together. It's in the name of Christ we lift this prayer. Amen.
Amen.